Okay, let's have a little conversation about the data that we have, about a week's worth of data that we have from the South Bay project. I'll just talk through this real fast and I'll tell you what I think I'm seeing in the data. And then obviously this is all open for discussion. And there's spreadsheets upon spreadsheets that are filled with this data for endless conversation. So first off, we have the outdoor air sensors. And so this is the outdoor air CO2 data. And it spans up, but generally the mean of the data was about 460. So that's outdoor air CO2. I'm calling that mean 460. Then this is indoor air CO2 data. And this first set of rooms are non-patient areas, facility services, a couple of nurses' stations, and basically working areas through the hospital. And what we're seeing here is a mean in the spaces of about 500, and you can kind of see each one of those charts is a bell curve, right? So the little light gray part below and above represent sort of the tail ends of the data, and then those two bars in the middle are the quadrant 2 and quadrant 3, and then the line in the middle there is the actual statistical mean of the data. We have 1 minute data for however long this period was every week. So we have data every minute for a week. And so that's the whole span of the data there. And then these are patient rooms. So we had a number of patient rooms that we were collecting. Basically the same, it's 500 again. And I think the margin of error on these CO2 sensors is certainly not zero. It's, I don't know, 20 ppm. We should have that conversation to make sure that we're talking about something relevant. But largely the same and about the same spread on the data that we see within the patient rooms. So then here's kind of where it gets fun. If we look at our outdoor air mean at 460 parts per million, we can sort of plot a theoretical relationship, assuming some occupancies and contaminant generation in the space. We can plot a theoretical relationship of what we believe the space CO2 rate should be as a function of air changes per hour. And then obviously our action levels are way above anything that we're seeing anywhere, 800, 1,000, 1,200 parts per million, that sort of thing. And you can see the points that we've plotted or that we've collected in these various rooms. We do have rooms as low as 2 air changes per hour. And then we have some in the 4, 6, 8 area. All of our patient rooms, since they're constant volume zones that are on perimeters, tend to be higher. So they're more like 10, 11, 12 air changes, but you can see where we fall. And this certainly sort of supports the hypothesis that in terms of CO2 dilution, we are way out on the asymptotic portion of the curve there. But according to this theory, we have every reason to believe that we could drop these air changes down to 2 air changes per hour or even lower and not come anywhere near our action ranges. So then switching tracks, this is the outdoor air particle data. The particle data that we have is for their optical sensors that measure particles of PM1 and greater, and it measures it in units of particle per liter. And so there's a lot more spread in this data, but the mean of this data was 1970 particle per liter across that period. And so then here's our indoor data for non-patient areas. Not all of these had particle sensors in them. But what you can see first off is that the data clusters very, very low. So the minimum is always 0. Oftentimes the first quadrile is 0, and in many cases the second quadrile is even 0. And then you get some third quadrile data that's up above 0, and then some fourth quadrile data that really just goes, you'll see these spikes. So just to show you kind of what that data looks like, this is the data for one of those rooms, the radiology office. And you can really see it, right? There's a ton of data down at 0. In fact, half of the data, or almost half of the data, is down at 0. So in some of these other rooms, 2/3 of the data is down at 0. And then you see some data sort of rising up to that 200, 400 part per million range, or I'm sorry, count per liter range. And then you see the spikes, in this case, spikes going up to 1,400 In some of the rooms, we had spikes that went well above 2,000, up to 4,000 or something like that. But that's kind of what these data sets look like for the particle observations. And then the mean is, you can kind of see in this one that the mean is, halfway up to that 200 line there, is where the statistical mean of this thing would actually come in. So here's the particle data for the patient rooms. Very similar data set. Again, in many cases, the whole first and second quadrile of the data is at the 0 point. You can see that room J is an exception to that rule. And then the third quadrile and fourth quadrile. So you'll see the mean that I'm listing here. This mean is not really a mean. What I've listed here as the average particle for all the indoor ranges is actually the third quadrile upper limit. So that 144 particles per liter. That's not the mean, because the mean was coming in at like 20, very close to 0. So I've actually listed, instead of the mean, I'm listing the upper limit of the third quadrile, essentially before the fourth quadrile begins, as sort of the number for the and that's important because that's the number that I'm showing on this point. So the data points that you're seeing, the orange dots at the bottom and the yellow dots at the bottom, are not the mean of the data taken in that room. It's actually the top of the third quadrile that you're seeing in that room. And so again, with this one, we have our outdoor air at 1970. Using that mean, we can plot this theoretical relationship of what we believe, particle data should look like within the spaces, and then sort of plot these points around that. And again, I think the same thing is true here, that we are clearly out in the, sort of asymptotic portion of this curve. We're statistically bouncing around that asymptotic portion of the curve, but we have every reason to believe that we can drop these air change rates, down to 2 air changes or below, and still have very, very good air quality within the spaces. Obviously, it'll vary by space, but we have all those sensors in place by space. So that's the data.